Most people in that county only saw the result, a name printed at the top of a report, the most productive farm in the district, highest yield per acre 3 years in a row, no debt, equipment paid off, land in better condition than when it started. And to most folks, it didn't mean much, just numbers on a page that came and went every year. But a few older men paused when they saw that name because they had seen it somewhere else before, not on a list anyone was proud of. And that's where this story really begins, not with the success, but with the question nobody said out loud. How does a man go from losing everything to owning more land than anyone around him, and doing it without asking anyone for help along the way? Because that kind of change doesn't happen by accident, and it doesn't happen quickly. It comes from something that most people don't see and don't understand unless they've had everything taken from them once. And 25 years earlier, that same name belonged to a boy who was told to leave his own hometown, not because of anything he did, but because of who his family was. And that boy was Daniel Sato. And the truth is, he didn't leave by choice. None of them did. One week they were working their farm like they always had, and the next week they were given a few days to pack what they could carry and leave everything else behind with no discussion and no time to argue. Just orders that didn't explain themselves and didn't need to. And when people hear that, they expect shouting or anger or something loud enough to match what was happening. But what Daniel remembered was how quiet it was, the kind of quiet that settles, and when people know there's nothing they can say that will change what's already been decided. His father moving through the farm one last time, without rushing, checking things out of habit, even though none of it mattered anymore, walking the fence line, looking over the rows the way he always had, not because he expected to see something different, but because that was how he had always done it. And men like him don't change their way of doing things even when everything around them changes. And the only moment that stayed with Daniel was when his father stopped in the yard and stood there a little longer than usual. And that was the only time he ever saw him break, not loudly and not in a way anyone else would notice, but enough that a 13-year-old boy would remember it for the rest of his life and understand later what it meant. And then they were gone, just like that, leaving behind a farm that had taken nearly 20 years to build, land that wasn't just dirt, but work and memory and time that had been put into it day after day, without anyone keeping track. And they didn't come back for more than 3 years. 3 years where everything that had been built was left to whatever happened in their absence. And when they did come back, there was almost nothing left to return to. The equipment was gone. The irrigation had been torn apart. The trees were dying or already dead. The house had been broken into and left open long enough that it no longer felt like something you could step back into. And it wasn't just the damage that hit Daniel when he stood there. It was the time that had been taken from them. Because you can rebuild equipment and you can replant trees, but you cannot replace the years that made them what they were. And time is the one thing you don't get back no matter how hard you work. And most people would have stopped right there, because starting over from that point doesn't make sense. Not on paper, and not at that age, and not with what they had left, which was almost nothing. And Daniel knew at the moment he stood there looking at what used to be theirs. He could see how far gone it was and how long it would take to fix. And part of him understood that walking away would be the easier choice. But his father didn't talk about what was gone. He didn't complain, and he didn't ask who took what, and he didn't go looking for help from people who had already decided to stay out of it. He walked the land row by row the same way he always had, slow and steady, not skipping anything. And when he was done, he said one thing: they took everything except the dirt. The dirt is enough. And at the time, Daniel didn't fully understand what that meant, because it sounded too simple for what they were facing. But he remembered it anyway, because his father didn't say things without reason. And that sentence stayed with him even when nothing else made sense. And 2 days later, Daniel drove into town because they needed tools. Not much, just enough to start fixing what could still be fixed. And there was only one place to go, the same place every farmer in that county went whether they liked it or not: the local equipment dealer. And Daniel had walked into that store before when he was younger, and it had never meant anything. It was just another stop, another errand. But this time it felt different before he even stepped inside. And you could feel it the moment he opened the door. Conversation slowed just a little, and people looked and then looked away. Nothing obvious and nothing anyone would admit to, just enough to tell you things had shifted in a way that wasn't going back. And Daniel waited at the counter like anyone else and asked for what he needed: simple tools, basic parts, whatever he could afford with what little they had left. And the man behind the counter didn't answer right away. He looked past Daniel and called someone over. And the owner came forward, an older man who had been there for years, a man who knew the family and knew the farm and knew exactly who he was looking at. And for a moment, it felt like maybe nothing would be said, and it would just be business the way it had always been. But that's not what happened. The man looked at Daniel and told him they weren't selling to him. Not today, and not anymore. And he didn't raise his voice, and he didn't make a scene. He said it in a way that made it sound final, like something that had already been decided before Daniel walked through the door. And Daniel stood there for a second. Not because he didn't understand, but because he did. And he said that he was born there, and that this was his home, and that he wasn't asking for anything except to buy what he needed to work his land. And the man didn't argue and didn't explain. He just shook his head and told him to leave. And that was it. No apology and no anger, just a door closing in. A way that made it clear it wasn't going to open again. And Daniel walked out the same way. He walked in and got in the truck and drove back. And the drive felt longer than it was because now he understood something he hadn't fully seen before, that even after everything that happened, there were still places where he would not be allowed to move forward. And when he told his father what happened, he didn't get the reaction most people expect. There was no anger and no frustration. His father listened and nodded once and said, "Then we don't need them." And he said it in the same calm voice he used for everything else, like the decision had already been made and didn't need to be discussed again. And that was the moment everything changed, not in a loud way and not in a way anyone else would notice, but in the only way that mattered. Because from that point on, there was no asking and no waiting and no expecting anyone to make things easier. There was only the work, and the work was going to decide everything that came next. Whether they failed or succeeded would come down to what they did with what they had left. And for the first time, Daniel began to understand what his father had meant when he said the dirt was enough. Not because it solved the problem, but because it gave them a place to start. And sometimes a place to start is all you get, and all you need if you're willing to stay with it long enough. And the work started the next morning because there was no reason to wait and no one coming to make it easier. Daniel was up before the sun, the way his father had always been, and for the first time, he understood that getting up early wasn't about discipline or routine. It was about getting ahead of a day that wasn't going to give him anything he didn't take from it. And when he stepped outside the farm, it didn't look like something ready to be worked. It looked like something that had been left behind and forgotten. Rows uneven, ground hard in places and soft in others. Irrigation lines missing or broken. Nothing moving the way it should. And for a moment, he stood there trying to take it all in, and the scale of it didn't make sense. There's too much to fix and not enough of anything to fix it with. And that's where most people would have stopped, because when the problem is bigger than what you have, it's easier to walk away than to pretend you can solve it. But his father didn't stand there long enough to let that thought take hold. He pointed to one section of land and said, "Start there." Just that. No explanation, no plan written out, just a place to begin. And that was how it went in the beginning. Not big changes and not anything anyone would notice from the road, just small pieces brought back one at a time, digging by hand where the lines had been pulled out, clearing sections that had been left to grow wild, testing what could still work and letting go of what couldn't. And the work didn't feel like progress at first. It felt like undoing damage that shouldn't have happened. And that kind of work wears on you in a different way, because you're not building something new. You're trying to get back to where you were before, and every hour you spend feels like it should have already been done. And there were days when the ground didn't respond the way it should have, and days when something they fixed the day before broke again, and days when it felt like the farm was pushing back harder than they could push forward. And Daniel began to understand how easy it would be to stop, not because he didn't care, but because there was no clear sign that what they were doing was going to work. And when there's no sign it's working, most people don't keep going long enough to find out. But his father never treated those days any differently. He showed up the same way every morning and worked the same way every day. And at night, he didn't talk about what went wrong. He talked about what was done, even if it was small, even if it didn't look like much, because he understood something Daniel was still learning, that the only way forward was to keep the work moving. Not to wait for it to feel right or look right, just to keep it moving long enough for it to matter. And slowly things began to shift in ways that weren't obvious at first. The water started to move where it was supposed to. The ground began to hold instead of giving way. The lines got straighter. The work from one day started to carry into the next instead of falling apart overnight. And Daniel began to see something he hadn't seen before, that the farm wasn't gone. it was still there underneath everything that had happened to it. And if he worked long enough and steady enough, it would come back. Not the way it had been before, but in a way that could still be built on. And that was the first time he began to understand what his father meant when he said the dirt was enough. Because the dirt didn't turn him away, and it didn't care where he had been or what had been taken from him. It responded the same way. Every time, you put work into it, and it gave something back. Not always what you expected and not always when you wanted it, but it gave something back. And that was more than he was getting anywhere else. And the first real test came when they tried to plant again. Not the whole farm, just a small section, enough to see if anything would take. And they didn't have the equipment they needed, so Daniel started looking for anything that could be made to work. And that's when he found the tractor, half buried behind a shed, rusted and worn and left there. Long enough that most people would have walked past it without a second thought. But his father didn't walk past it. He looked at it for a long moment and said it might run. Not that it would, just that it might. And that was enough because it maybe was all they had to work with. And Daniel took it apart piece by piece without knowing exactly what he was doing, learning as he went, making mistakes and fixing them and going back again when something didn't fit the way it should. And it took longer than he expected and broke down more times than he could count. But one morning it turned over just long enough to catch. And when it did, his father placed his hand on the hood and closed his eyes for a second, not in celebration and not in relief, just in recognition, like something had come back that they could use. And that machine wasn't much, and it didn't solve their problems. But it gave them movement, and it gave them a way to start planting. And that first planting didn't go the way Daniel hoped. Some rows came up strong, and others barely held. Some sections looked promising, and others looked like they had been wasted effort. And when he saw it, he felt that same doubt again, the kind that tells you maybe this isn't going to work. Maybe you're just delaying the moment when you have to walk away. But his father didn't look at it that way. He walked the rows the same way he always had and said it's enough to keep going. And that became his standard from that point on. Not perfect and not even good, just enough to keep going. And that changed the way Daniel saw everything, because now the goal wasn't to fix everything at once. It was to keep moving forward without stopping. And that made the next day easier to face because the expectation wasn't to solve the whole problem. It was to do what could be done and then come back and do it again. And that's how the months passed. Not with big changes and not with anything that would make people stop and take notice, but with small gains that started to hold, a line that stayed in place, a section that didn't fail, a crop that gave back just enough to prove it could work. And by the end of that first year, they had enough to get through the winter. Not more than that, and not anything anyone would call success, but enough. And for Daniel, that was the first real sign that what they were doing could work, not all at once and not quickly, but steadily. And once he saw that, it changed the way he approached everything that came after, because now he wasn't trying to get back what had been lost. He was building something new from what remained, and that difference mattered more than anything else. And by the time the second year came around to work, no longer felt like trying to undo what had been done to the farm and started to feel more like building something that could actually stand on its own. Daniel stopped thinking in terms of what they used to have and began thinking in terms of what could still be made to work. And that change didn't make the days shorter or the labor easier, but it made every decision clearer, because now each piece of effort had a direction instead of just filling a gap. And for the first time since they came back, there were moments when he could look across the ground and see progress instead of damage. Not everywhere and not all at once, but enough to recognize that something was taking hold. And those moments mattered more than he expected, because they gave him something he hadn't had before, a reason to believe that the next step was worth taking. And once that belief is there, even in a small way, it carries you further than anything else. And the farm began to respond in ways that were hard to notice unless you were out there every day. The soil held moisture longer, the rows stayed consistent, the plants came up more evenly, and the work from one week started to carry into the next instead of falling apart overnight. And Daniel realized that what his father had been doing all along wasn't just working hard, it was working in a way that built on itself. And that was something he had to learn through repetition rather than explanation. And as he learned it, the work changed again, not in how much he did, but in how he did it. Fewer wasted steps, fewer decisions made out of frustration, more time spent on things that would still matter the next day. And that kind of adjustment doesn't show up right away, but once it does, it changes everything that follows. And there were still people in town who kept their distance. Still places where the conversation would slow when he walked in, but those moments didn't carry the same weight anymore because they no longer decided what he did next. And that shift was quiet, but it was real because now the farm had become the only place where the rules made sense, where effort led to results, and results came from choices he could control, and that was enough to keep him moving forward without needing anything else. And then came the first season where the results were strong enough that even people who weren't looking closely began to notice, not in a way that brought praise or changed attitudes overnight, but in the way they watched a little longer when they passed by, in the way questions started being asked without being directed at him. And those questions mattered not because he needed the attention, but because they showed that what he was doing could no longer be ignored. And Daniel didn't respond to that by changing how he worked or trying to explain what he was doing. He stayed with the same approach because he understood that the work itself was the only answer that held up over time. And his father saw it too, not in the numbers or the attention, but in the way the land held together, in the way fewer things needed fixing and more things continued working on their own. And one evening after they finished walking the rows, his father said, "You see now." And Daniel did see, not just the results, but the process that led to them, the way each small decision added up over time until it reached a point where it could no longer be dismissed as luck or coincidence. And for a moment, it felt like they had reached something solid, something that could carry them forward without constant uncertainty. But Daniel had learned enough by then to know that reaching that point didn't mean stopping. It meant deciding what came next. Because if you stay in the same place long enough, you eventually become dependent on it in a way that can be taken from you again. And he had no intention of putting himself in that position. So instead of holding on to what they had, he began to think about how to expand it. Not quickly, and not in a way that would risk what they had already built, but steadily in the same way everything else had been done. And the opportunity came in the form of land that others had passed over, ground that required more work than most were willing to give. And Daniel recognized something in that, because it matched exactly what he had been doing since the beginning, taking what others didn't want and turning it into something that worked. And the first time he decided to take that step, he didn't talk about it much. He didn't try to make it into something larger than it needed to be. He simply made the decision and followed through, using what they had saved and putting it back into the ground in a way that most people would have seen as a risk. But to him, it wasn't a risk. It was a continuation of the same process that had already proven itself. And when he added that first piece of land, it didn't make things easier. It made the work heavier and the days longer and the decisions more important, but it also proved something that changed the way he saw everything after that, that the limits he thought he had were not fixed. They moved depending on what he was willing to take on and how well he was willing to carry it. And once he understood that, it became harder to stay where he was, not out of ambition, but out of clarity, because now he knew that what he had built could support more if he approached it the same way. And over the next years, that approach continued to show results. Not sudden and not dramatic, but steady and consistent. More land brought under control, more output that held from one season to the next, fewer setbacks that forced him backward. And the town began to notice in a different way now, not just watching but acknowledging, not openly praising but no longer ignoring. And the name that had once been pushed aside started to come back into conversation. Not because of where it had been before, but because of what it stood for now. And Daniel never chased that recognition and never depended on it, because he had already learned that it could change without warning. But he understood that it meant something had shifted, not in how people felt, but in what they could no longer deny. And that was enough to confirm what he already knew, that the work was moving in the right direction, and that as long as he stayed with it, everything else would follow in time. And by the time the years began to stack on top of each other, Daniel no longer had to think about whether the farm would hold, because it already had. The ground responded the way it should, the system stayed in place, and the kind of problems that once took days to fix were now handled before they had a chance to grow into something larger. And that didn't happen by accident. It happened because every decision he had made up to that point had been built on the same idea: don't push faster than you can hold, and don't depend on anything you can't replace. And that way of working shaped everything that came after, because now when he looked at the land, he wasn't seeing what needed to be fixed. He was seeing what could be improved. And there's a difference between those two things that changes how you move forward, because fixing keeps you in place and improving moves you beyond it. And Daniel moved forward carefully, adding land only when the ground he already had was working the way it should, making sure that what he built could carry itself before he added anything more to it. And that kind of patience is something most people don't have because it doesn't show results right away, but over time it creates something stronger than anything built quickly, and that strength began to show in ways that couldn't be overlooked. The yields held steady year after year, the quality of the crops improved. The land itself looked different from the farms around it. Not because it was larger, but because it was better kept, better understood. And that difference drew attention whether he wanted it to or not. And the same people who had once kept their distance now watched with a different kind of interest, not the kind that judges, but the kind that tries to understand. And some of them began to ask questions, not directly at first, not in a way that would admit they had been wrong before, but in small ways that opened the door just enough, and Daniel answered those questions. The same way he answered everything else, by continuing to work, by letting the results speak without turning them into something they weren't. And his father was still there through those years, moving slower now, but seeing just as much as he always had. And there were evenings when they would walk the edge of a field together and not say anything at all because there was nothing that needed to be said. The work was there in front of them, and that was enough. And one evening his father stopped. Again the way he had years before. Not in the same place, but with the same stillness. And Daniel recognized at this time, not as something breaking, but as something settling. And his father said, "You've done enough to keep going without me." And there was no hesitation in his voice and no doubt in what he meant. And Daniel didn't answer right away because he understood that there wasn't anything to add. And when his father passed, not long after, it didn't change the direction of the work. It deepened it, because now everything he did carried the weight of what had been built before him. And that kind of weight doesn't slow you down if you understand it. It sharpens you. It makes every decision clearer because there's no room for waste and no reason to hesitate. And Daniel carried that forward in the only way he knew how, by continuing to build, by adding land when it made sense, by improving what he already had instead of chasing what he didn't understand. And over time, the farm reached a point where it was no longer something people talked about quietly. Became something that showed up in reports and records and conversations that didn't stop when his name was mentioned. And that shift didn't come with an apology from anyone who had turned him away before. It didn't come with explanations or changed words that tried to make up for what had been done. It came with something more lasting. Recognition that didn't depend on anyone's approval because it was backed by results that couldn't be argued with. And there was a moment when that recognition circled back to where it had once been denied. Not in a dramatic way, and not in a way anyone would have planned, but in a quiet visit one afternoon when a man from that same dealership came out to see the farm. Not the same man as before, but someone who knew the history well enough to understand what it meant to be standing there. And he spoke carefully, not trying to rewrite the past, and not pretending it hadn't happened. Just acknowledging it in the only way he could, by saying the door had been closed when it shouldn't have been and that it would not be closed now. And Daniel listened without interrupting and without showing much reaction. And when the man finished, he didn't argue, and he didn't accept what was being offered. Not because he was holding on to anger, and not because he needed to prove anything, but because it wasn't needed anymore. And he said he had already found another way, and that it had worked just fine. And that was the end of it. No raised voices and no attempt to settle anything that had already passed. Just a clear line between what had been and what was now. And the man left understanding something he likely hadn't before, that some things are not corrected by going back. They are corrected by moving forward far enough that they no longer hold the same weight. And Daniel went back to his work the same way he always had, because the work had never been about proving anyone wrong. It had been about building something that could not be taken from him. Again, and by then he had done exactly that. Not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that held steady year after year. And that kind of success doesn't fade quickly. It carries forward and becomes something others measure themselves against, whether they admit it or not. And Daniel never set out to be the kind of example, but over time that is what he became. simply by staying with the work long enough for it to speak for itself. And by the time Daniel reached the point where the farm no longer needed to be pushed forward every single day, he began to understand something that had taken him years to see clearly, that the hardest part of everything he had done was never the labor, and never the long days, and never the setbacks that came without warning. It was the decision he made early on to continue when there was no sign that anything would come back to him. Because once that decision was made, everything else became a matter of staying with it long enough for it to take shape. And by then the farm had become something steady, something that held together without needing to be rebuilt over and over again. The ground responded the way it should. The systems worked without constant attention, and the seasons moved in a way that no longer felt uncertain. And for the first time, there were mornings when he stepped outside and didn't feel like he had to prove anything to the day ahead of him. And that didn't mean he worked less. It meant he worked differently, because now he wasn't trying to recover something that had been taken, was maintaining something that had already been built. And there's a difference between those two things that only becomes clear when you've lived through both. And the people around him had changed in small ways that added up over time. The same places that once felt closed no longer did. The same conversations that had once slowed now carried on. And it wasn't that anyone had come forward to admit they were wrong or to make up for what had been done. It was simply that what Daniel had built could no longer be ignored. And when something reaches that point, it stops needing approval. It stands on its own. And Daniel understood that better than most because he had built it without relying on anything that could be taken away again. And that understanding shaped what he chose to do next. Because there comes a time when a man has to decide whether what he has built is only for himself or whether it can carry something beyond him. And Daniel made that decision quietly, the same way he had made every decision that mattered, not by announcing it and not by turning it into something larger than it needed to be, but by setting aside a part of what the farm produced each year and using it to create a path for others who might otherwise be turned away. And he didn't do it out of obligation, and he didn't do it to make a point. He did it because he remembered what it felt like to stand in a place where the door was closed without explanation. And he knew that most people don't need someone to carry them forward. They need a chance to take the first step on their own. And that became the principle behind everything he did from that point on. Whether it was helping a young farmer get started with a small piece of land or offering equipment when they needed it without binding them to anything they couldn't get out of, or creating an opportunity that gave them room to work without being pushed into failure before they had a chance to learn, and he never followed up in a way that placed himself above them. He didn't track their success as if it reflected back on him. He simply made sure the opportunity existed and left the rest to them, because he believed that the same rule applied, that what matters is not what you're given, but what you do with it once it is yours to use. And over time, those quiet decisions began to reach further than he expected. Not in a way that drew attention, but in a way that created movement. People who might have stayed where they were found a way forward. Farms that might have been lost were rebuilt, and the pattern repeated itself in ways that didn't need to be recorded to be understood. And Daniel saw that not as something he had done, but as a continuation of the same idea his father had given him, that what remains is enough if you are willing to use it. And there were still moments when the past returned in small ways, not as something that needed to be corrected, but as something that had shaped everything that followed. And one of those moments came when a man from that same dealership drove out to see the farm. Not the same man as before, but someone who understood what had happened well enough to know what it meant to be standing there. And he spoke plainly, not trying to change the past and not pretending it hadn't happened, just acknowledging it in the only way he could, by saying the door had been closed when it should not have been and that it would not be closed now. And Daniel listened without interrupting and without showing much reaction. And when the man finished, he didn't argue and he didn't accept what was being offered. Not because he held on to anger and not because he needed to prove anything, but because it was no longer necessary. And he said that he had already found another way and that it had worked, and that was enough. And that was the end of it. No attempt to settle what had already passed. Just a clear understanding that some things are not undone, they are outgrown. And Daniel returned to his work the same way he always had, because the work had never been about proving anyone wrong. It had been about building something that could not be taken from him again. And by then he had done exactly that. not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that held steady year after year. And as time went on, the farm began to carry itself in a way that no longer required him at the center of every decision. His son stepping into the work the same way he once had, learning not through explanation alone, but through repetition and attention and the quiet. Understanding that comes from doing something long enough to know it without having to think about it. And there were moments when Daniel stood back and watched without stepping in, not because he had nothing to add, but because he understood that some things have to be learned without being told. And in those moments, he saw the same patterns take shape, the same care in the work, the same patience in the decisions. And that was when he knew that what had been built would continue. Not exactly. The same, but steady in the way that mattered. And in his later years, he found himself returning to the same small routines that had carried him through the hardest parts of his life, walking the land without rushing, checking the same points he had always checked, stopping now and then not because something was wrong, but because something was right, and he wanted to take a moment to see it. And there was one place he returned to more than any other, the old tractor he had rebuilt when everything else had been gone, kept not as a symbol of hardship, but as a reminder of where things had turned. And each time he placed his hand on it, he remembered that first morning it had come back to life. Not as a victory, but as a beginning, because that was all it had ever been, a beginning that led to everything that followed. And when people asked him in those later years what mattered most, what he wanted others to understand about everything he had done, he didn't talk about the land or the numbers or the recognition. He didn't talk about the people who had turned him away or the ones who had come back later with different words. He talked about the moment when there was almost nothing left and the decision was made to keep going anyway. And he said that most people think they need more than they do to begin again, when in reality what they have left is often enough if they are willing to use it. And that idea stayed with those who heard it, because it wasn't something he had explained, it was something he had lived. And by the time Daniel stepped away from the work completely, the farm no longer depended on him to continue. It had become something steady, something that would carry forward because it had been built in a way that could not be easily undone. And the name that had once appeared on a list no one wanted to be on now stood for something that could not be taken away. Not because of recognition and not because of records, but because of the way it had been built. And that is why when people speak about him now, they don't start with the success. They start with the fact that he came back when it would have been easier not to, that he rebuilt when it didn't make sense to try, and that he never waited for anyone to make it easier for him. And in the end, that is what remains. Not the lists and not the numbers, but the example of what can be done when a man decides that what is left is enough and chooses to build from there without looking back.